is a very real problem. ISIS is a problem. Al-Qaeda is a problem. These militant Islamic groups like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like the Taliban have to be dealt with. But it doesn't actually help us to deal with them when instead of talking about rational conflicts, rational criticisms of a particular religion, we instead so easily slip into bigotry by simply painting everyone with a single brush.
You're watching The World from Below, and that was a clip of academic Reza Aslan explaining the difficulties of having a constructive discussion about Islam in the political climate of America. Tonight we're talking to Dr Scott Burchill, an expert in international relations, about the rise of the so-called Islamic State and the response of the West. We now turn to talk about how Islam as a global phenomenon is being portrayed in Western nations such as the United States and Australia. Andrew Bolt, Australia's most read columnist, recently wrote about Islam's violent tendencies in a column next to a picture of Hitler. How do you think this kind of commentary is received internationally, Scott?
Well, I think there's a huge mistake to conflate discussion about Islam as a religion and the activities of those who invoke it for political and strategic reasons. And I think the fatal mistake that the West always tends to make is to mix the two together. The way to understand ISIS is as a political movement that is fighting militarily for territory and fighting in a sectarian conflict with another group. But to talk about this as a Muslim-wide or a problem with a religion is simply a distraction from the central arguments. And frankly, the conflict, I think, is best understood by almost leaving Islam out of the discussion entirely. And in that way, not, for example, how do you explain the fact that ISIL's number one enemy is an Islamic sect called the Shiites? That's the first point. So this suggests that somehow there's something wrong with Islam, and look, here is what Muslims do, is a defamation of billions of people who, of course, live their lives in peace and harmony every day. And unfortunately, there's the temptation to look at this through the prism of a religion that someone doesn't like is just too overwhelming for some.
I mean, obviously, we also have some near neighbours in the Pacific who are nations with majority Muslim populations, and I can't imagine that reflects well.
Well, yeah, but their comments are very clever and quite sensible. They say this has nothing to do with Islam, end of story. We're the ones that tend to perpetuate this mix of militancy in Islam and try to establish threads and connections as if somehow the religion has some sort of fault in it that has to be corrected to stop the militancy of those who invoke its name. Well, I think the Islamic states like Indonesia have a much more mature approach and a much more sensible one.
I wanted to talk about also Iran, because I think any conversation about the conflict with the Islamic State has to include a discussion of Iran as well. Can you tell us how you think it fits in?
Well, Iran would be the most logical enemy of ISIL because Iran is predominantly Shiite and they regard ISIL as a Sunni threat near their border. But because the United States has a poisoned relationship with Iran going back to the 1970s, they can't be seen to ask or invoke Iran in this battle, which is just another example of how hypocritical and kind of misguided US policy is. The Iranians have already got some troops in Iraq because they regard themselves as being in many ways post-Saddam Iraq's patron, and they are absolutely determined that a Sunni militant group like ISIL doesn't make any further ground. But the Americans won't even talk directly to the Iranians, so let alone getting them on board in a common struggle. Foolish in the extreme. The Iranians would be more than happy, I think, to engage in that struggle, and it would be an interesting way of organising a serious rapprochement between the US and Iran if they were to work together. And
they're well equipped to do so, I would have thought.
Oh, very well equipped, much more highly trained. They've got significant military forces themselves. But the Americans are discounting all this because of a political fight that goes back to 1979.
Do you think they're talking behind the scenes?
Undoubtedly, informally they are, but a US president who claims to be talking directly with the president of Iran or the president of Cuba fires a sort of a fatal political bullet at his own head, and they just won't do it. It's a blind spot in American politics and American foreign policy, which has been going on in the case of Cuba since the 1960s, but in the case of Iran since the late 1970s. And unfortunately, this further ties America's hands in these sort of struggles in the Middle East.
It's a blind spot that may end up costing them dearly.
Indeed.
Can you tell me, if we just listened to Tony Abbott, we'd probably know little more about Islamic State other than it is a death cult. What are the kind of resources that you recommend to people who are interested in finding out more about this conflict with a nuanced perspective?
Look, there are some very good commentators. Patrick Coburn in The Independent in London has written a very good introductory book on the rise of ISIL, when no one was taking any interest in the organisation, didn't regard it as a significant entity at all. So he's a very important correspondent worth following. But the business press is much better than the popular press, because the business press can't afford to deceive its readership.
More into real politics.
There's no point in engaging in ideological arguments in the business press. They need to know what the facts are.
They need to get down to business.
So I use the Financial Times in the opinion pages of the Financial Times a lot, because you get a no-nonsense analysis of what is going on there, and from very, very good commentators who know what they're really talking about.
Dr Scott Burchill, thank you for appearing on our program tonight. That's unfortunately all we have time for on this week's episode of The World from Below. I'd also like to thank all our crew and producers and our host RMI TV. You've been watching The World from Below. Until next week, thanks for joining us.